Thanks for joining us here on your Friday to talk about race and justice, two things the country hasn't always put together very well. I want to take a minute to situate ourselves in the Bay and in the expertise that we have here on the panel. And so I want each of you to describe the community in which you work, the place in which you work, and what you do there. I'll start with you, Joy.
So I work in Bayview Hunters Point. In the southeast sector of San Francisco, one of the most marginalized populations here. Our median household income is $29,000 compared to the $104,000 of the average household here in San Francisco. Mainly made up of people of color. Just became an African American cultural district recently this week. But there's a lot of history around hardworking families that are now being displaced due to gentrification.
Mm-hmm. And where do you work there? What's your organization?
3rd Street Youth Center and Clinic.
So you're working with the kids?
12 to 24.
Wow. All right, and we'll come back to that.
I'm Zachary Norris. I'm the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. We're based in Oakland, California. I was actually born here in San Francisco. We moved to Oakland when I was a week old. I like to say it was a week too late, not because I don't love San Francisco, but just because I love Oakland that much, and also because it was, a result of already rising costs that my parents moved. Most of my family was born and raised in San Francisco on my dad's side, who's African American, my mom's white, and only my auntie is still in San Francisco. And that kind of change we're also seeing in Oakland. And so our organization is actually moving from downtown Oakland. We co-purchased a building in the Fruitvale district, which I'll tell you more about, to put forward a vision of development without displacement and a new vision of community safety.
Cool.
I'm Karina Montag. I'm with the Insight Prison Project, and most of my work is centered inside of San Quentin as well as other prisons throughout the state. I'm also a native San Franciscan. I was born and raised in the Fillmore and moved to the East Bay about 15 years ago. And we do at IPP transformative in-prison programming around trauma and harm.
Wow. So Joe, I want to come back to the kids that you work with, and what makes them feel safe?
Wow, that's such an interesting question. I remember the story where we did an exercise with our young people, and there was a 14-year-old who said, we don't have no flowers. And when she said that, she was talking about that's what made her feel safe. Something as simple as having flowers outside of her door, like other neighborhoods that she traveled to, made her feel safe and feel cared about. So for them, having their own space that looks like it's taken care of is what helps them feel safe.
Huh, that's interesting. What about, how do people talk about the criminal justice system inside of San Quentin?
It's a big conversation. I think that the way that we sort of locate a lot of the work is it's rooted in restorative justice. So in opposition to our current punitive justice system. And there's also a real impetus to start pulling back further and looking at it from a transformative lens. So not just individual dialogue between responsible persons and survivors, but also really looking at what are the conditions that lead to one causing harm and really holding the wisdom that no one enters harm for the first time by causing it. And so how do we look at transforming the conditions that precipitated that harm?
Zach, what do you know about crime and policing and public safety as someone who's been studying this for a long time? That you think people in both the general public as well as maybe within the sort of elected officialdom don't understand or should rethink?
That is fundamental to our democracy. One of the things that I like to say is Since the Emancipation Proclamation, the criminal justice system has been used to put Black people back into chains. And so it has been the primary system for sorting people, deserving versus undeserving. And so when we look at Trump's push to, in my mind, reestablish a hierarchy of personhood, the roots of that, the tracks of that train wreck that is his administration is really the criminal justice system, because it's been used as that sorting system. And we have to be able to come up with a different justice system that recognizes that each of us are more than our worst mistake, that we are all capable of redemption. That's something that I saw when I grew up in East Oakland. I went to Harvard as an undergrad, and when a young person got in trouble at Harvard, they were given the services and support they needed, the counseling they needed to get back on track and continue along the trajectory they were on. Meanwhile, I saw friends from my community locked up for doing very similar things. And so for me, I still don't see that being recognized by enough public officials in ways that don't just address the current harm, but really address the legacy that leads up to it.
Yeah, and you know, obviously there's like a library full of books about how Black people have been criminalized in America, but how has that like intersected with the current sort of economic climate of the Bay, where there has just been, you know, a loss of all kinds of affordable housing, as well as sort of rising costs of everything?
I think the biggest gripe that I hear from young people is, why do I have to be in trouble to get the services that I need? So in order to get fast track for a city job, you might have to be on probation. But we could have prevented that. Why do I have to have an unwanted pregnancy to get fast track for housing? So I think we need to change the way we invest in young people. If we're spending $300,000 per young person per year in the criminal justice system, if we took a third of that and invested $100,000 in the education, in the support systems, in their nutrition, in their housing, imagine the sort of productivity and innovation we would be getting from these young people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is Ella Baker's core mission, right?
Yeah, so we advance what we call the truth and reinvestment agenda, addressing this long history of racial injustice and then reinvesting resources back into communities in the form of books not bars, jobs not jails, healthcare not handcuffs. But quite frankly, for most of our 20-year history, we were better at the not handcuffs than the healthcare, the not bars than the books. And so what we're putting forward with Restore Oakland, this building that I talked about, we purchased it with the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, and the idea is to put forward a new vision of community safety. When people think of safety, too often we think they're thinking of punishment in prisons, they're thinking of the law and order mythologies that are produced on that TV show. Instead, they should be thinking about the wisdom from communities who said that we want restorative justice, we want economic opportunity, not as a result of our involvement in the justice system, but because everyone understands that for all communities, that is fundamental to safety. And so this new space on the first floor will house a restaurant run by formerly incarcerated folks and others who have been locked out of opportunity, worker training programs so people can access career ladder jobs in the restaurant industry, of which there are a growing number, but there are almost those fine dining positions are almost exclusively held by white men. On the second floor, there will be one of the only dedicated spaces to restorative justice, so people can be held accountable and yet still held in community. And then most importantly, throughout the building, there will be organizing and advocacy to bring those solutions to scale, because Bay Area politicians are good at kind of patting pet projects on the head and saying, we support restorative justice, we support economic opportunity, without actually bringing those investments to a broader scale.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about what a restorative justice model means sort of inside as well as sort of outside in the broader community?
Sure. So inside, true restorative justice means bringing together the survivor, the victim, and the responsible party or parties. So inside a true restorative justice process could look like a victim-offender dialogue, where we work for a long time with each party before bringing them together to have a true and deep and honest, radically honest, accountable conversation of the harm that happened, and ask the survivor or victim, and what do we need to do to make this sort of as right as possible? Then there are methods that employ restorative practices, where we're bringing together community members, people to discuss the harm that happened, but it might not be with the direct victim or survivor, it might be with a surrogate survivor. Outside, I really appreciate what Zach is speaking to, which is the reintegration piece that often sort of gets dropped off. Like, we've had this process, but now how do we reintegrate folks back into the community? And as a community, how do we welcome folks back in ways that are meaningful, sustainable, and that really pull into task our accountability as community members and stakeholders?
What about people who are coming back to communities that have just been eviscerated, radically changed by economic circumstances? Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you, are there support services for people who, were from somewhere in Oakland that has radically changed, and they come back and like the people they once knew are gone? Where do they go?
Yeah.
Well,
Zach nodding. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've experienced recently is going to a picnic out in Antioch that my aunt held, and it was almost exclusively folks from a particular neighborhood in San Francisco. And so I think one thing is that communities support each other, and we find ways to create new networks. I think some of our organizing has to be more regional, so we do organize people who are impacted by the criminal justice system. And given displacement in the Bay Area, we've thought about how we address not just particular cities, but counties. And so one of the campaigns that we're working on is a county-wide campaign to audit the sheriff's finances. And we're organizing people to look at why is it that the sheriff continues to get more resources even though the jail population in Alameda County is going down. And so we have been successful in moving some of those budgets, but I think it's partly about an organizing strategy that is more regional and yet still drives that reinvestment agenda.
So one of the things that, living in Oakland, running in circles that can be fairly radical at times, one of the things that you hear a lot is like, we need to end policing. There's, a book by that same name, which kind of makes this argument pretty forcefully, like let's end policing. But then if you look at sort of polling for those things among white Americans, like the number of people who would say, yeah, let's end policing is like fairly small. So what would that actually mean to make like radical reform to the criminal justice system, particularly around the way that Black communities are policed?
For my young people, I think about training for the police, equipping them with knowing what social services they can refer young people to versus taking them in. A lot of times people are connected to churches, to youth centers, and they don't take the time to learn that. It's just let's lock them up and then deal with it later. I also think that training shouldn't be voluntary. I think it should be mandatory. When we talk about trauma-informed trainings, I think it needs to be trauma-informed action. And I think it starts with the police knowing where people are coming from and not making it so that the ones who are in our neighborhoods only get that sort of training.
It's a complex question, and I want to start by saying, people of color also aren't in this space by and large where folks are like, we need to end policing, right? Safety is a critical and fundamental issue. And so you can't, as a young person, go to school and be concentrating on your studies if you're worried about getting harmed on the way there or on the way back. And so, as a dad, as someone who in the first year we moved into our new house in East Oakland, it was broken into 2 times. There was, glass on my daughter's bed where they broke into our house. I understand the desire for safety. And I want to just have us take a step back and ask ourselves, are we safer as a result of the policies that we've enacted in this country? We've locked up more people than any country across the world. We rely on a strategy of catching bad guys in a way that I think has not served us. So we do absolutely have to create strategies to intervene in harm, but I think we can move away from a punishment and prisons approach as the primary strategy. How might we do that? We would invest in public health solutions to public health problems. So drug use and abuse, homelessness, school discipline, should all be treated as the public health issues that they are. Secondly, in places across the globe, people have invested in what they call community guardians, where trusted community members are the first responders rather than police always being the first responders when harm happens. Patrick Sharkey, a researcher, showed that each time a new nonprofit focused on violence prevention shows up in the city, there's a measurable decrease in crime. Yet those people are primarily volunteers. They're formerly incarcerated folks who are talking to youngsters. They are, community, their grandmothers and aunties who are intervening. Those people go unpaid. They go under-acknowledged and under-supported. What if instead of, continuing to expand police budgets, which are 60% of many city budgets across the country, we actually invested in those kinds of solutions that have been proven effective. So I think through a mix of strategies, while we may not end policing, we can actually make it more community-oriented through a divest and invest strategy, divesting away from punishment and prisons and a police first response, and investing in community-driven solutions that are public health oriented.
How do you, that's a good answer. It's interesting to think about the reaction to crack in the 80s and the reaction to like opioids now, and just how much more public health emphasis there has been recently. But I think that, to like spin it forward just a little bit, the question is, as people start to see, people in rural, suburban places start to see drugs as a public health problem, can that actually be, that same idea be deployed in urban America or not? Like, do you see signs that people are beginning to apply that same thinking, in prisons, in cities, and not just in the West Virginia case?
I hope so. I was reading an article about Burlington, Vermont. I think it was Burlington. It was a city in Vermont. And the police chief was counseling the hospital on how they should be using detox drugs the first time someone comes in, was counseling the prosecutor on not charging, was, basically leading this like citywide effort to adopt a public health approach to opioid usage. And it was just mind-blowing to me as a criminal justice advocate, because it did have me take a step back and say, well, when people see the humanity of the folks who are dealing with drug use and abuse, there's a radically different world that is possible. So the optimist in me says, yes, it's possible. We need to, all of us join in that effort to produce change city by city. The pessimist in me says we have to get to the root of the deserving versus undeserving. And I think that obviously the new administration is bringing that to our full attention. And so it's going to take some organizing, it's going to take some effort, but I do think we can get to a place where that Burlington example is more widespread, not just in white communities, but in communities across the country.
I'm going to come to questions in just a sec, so get those ready. But I just want to, Joy, I want to give, if some of your kids were here, what do you think they would want this audience to hear about public safety?
I think we need to really invest in them. I think we have told them that they don't matter. We have told them in a way that we have not invested in their schools. We have not invested in their ideas. We have not invested in their housing, their safety. We have told them that for generations. And now we are standing in this audience as folks who have been disinvested in, right? So I really hope that, and I hear this every day, that all they really want is for us to show that we care about them. And I think once we start to do that, we can change the way this country is run. We're seeing it in the young politicians coming up. Someone invested in them. And I think the kids that we serve are intelligent, they're innovative, and they have a strong work ethic. But the way they apply it tends to steer towards negativity. So if we can somehow counter that, we will start to see this country change.
Cool. Got a question right here.
Hey, everybody. Rocky Hip Holman, a supervisor for a transitional age youth program here in San Francisco with Community Works West. Thank you all first, this panel here, and what's happening, Sister Karina? I'm really glad to see you on this panel. So, Zach, you brought up the administration's name that should not be said. And I was wondering what I wanted to ask this panel specifically, what you all thought about the criminal justice reform, that supposedly Jared Kushner, is spearheaded, but was really, most of it is like it's work that's been done during the Obama administration. But how do you all see that playing out with what's going on here in San Francisco?
I first want to lift up Community Works West and appreciate y'all for the work that y'all do, and Ruth is in the audience as well. Community Works West and Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth will be the primary folks assisting us and supporting and leading the restorative justice work that happens in Restore Oakland, that building that I talked about. The Ella Baker Center is not by any stretch of the imagination an expert in restorative justice. And so we lean on y'all in terms of being able to and advancing restorative justice. And so we're gonna have a space that not only has formal referrals from the district attorney and probation office, but a community space where people can just do restorative justice and build out that muscle to actually problem solve and to resolve conflict. And the First Step Act that you referenced, I think, is one of these acts that I think does some good things that you would think should already be the law, like ensuring that women in prison have access to sanitary supplies. I mean, just basic human dignity, human rights things that we should already have been done years and decades ago. And so for that reason, we supported the First Step Act as an organization. And I think that there's complications and challenges with the act as well, just to be real, that there are ways in which I think too often certain parts of our communities get pitted against others in ways that complicate the reforms and make them challenging to have wholehearted endorsements of. So I think that the people who will have opportunity to come home as a result of the First Step Act is incredibly important. And as someone who is not formally incarcerated, as someone who is light-skinned African-American who doesn't face the same level of discrimination that some of my own cousins do, I wanted to hear from those folks who are saying, this is an opportunity for me to come home, and value that in terms of our position on it as an organization.
Let's take one last question.
Good morning. My name is Miguel Bustos, born and raised in the Mission District when it was a mission. I'm Senior Director for the Center for Social Justice at GLIDE, right here in the Tenderloin with my crew here. And one of the things, and this is maybe a challenge for everybody, we saw with Prop C which was a proposition to provide more funding for housing that actually Ben led for GLIDE as a way of coming together. And I think we need to see things also from a regional perspective. Housing, criminal reform is not just a tenderloin issue. It's not just a mission issue. We've seen many tech companies come in, not hire our people, right? And they're not building housing for the new people. So I think, and it's a challenge for us to be bold. And I think what Prop C taught us is that coming together, even if you think it's not your issue, stand with people whose issue it is. That's the way I think we're going to do this. And we need to do it from a regional. So we need to clasp hands of our friends in the East Bay and say, let's stick together and let's make this happen. But we have to make sometimes people uncomfortable. But as Reverend Cecil Williams says, we are truth tellers and truth seekers. So it's more of a challenge than anything, but I just appreciate all your work.
Any last responses, Corinne?
Yeah, I agree that this needs to be a larger movement, and it needs to be a really deep internal movement, and it needs to be larger than regional, because I think that it's very easy for us to do this us and them. I'm not this, I am this. You are this, I'm not this. We all hold accountability. We all hold accountability to white dominance and participating and being complicit, even if we don't have white skin privilege, right? It seems women and men, we all hold these pieces together with our trans brothers and sisters. So I think that it's a way of shifting a whole way of looking at this system, and that's how we move into something new that we don't currently have. So for me, yes, reform, while we are also envisioning something completely different.
All right, thank you so much, panel. Have a great day.